I'm Eli Marlowe. I'm 33 years old, and my father and brother tried to get away with murdering my grandfather. Before I tell you how I exposed them in front of their own company, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It started 5 years ago on a Tuesday that felt like any other. My grandfather, Arthur Whitmore, went on his annual hunting trip to Colorado. He was 75, but he had a grip that could make a man half his age wince. He used to tell me, "Eli, a man's worth isn't in his bank account. It's in his handshake. Make sure yours is firm and your word is solid." He built Whitmore Dynamics from the ground up on that principle, a company that didn't just build things, it built them to last with integrity. He was more of a father to me than my own dad ever was. The call came on a Thursday. A park ranger with a flat, professional voice. They'd found Arthur's truck, his gear neatly packed, but no sign of him. A freak autumn storm had rolled in, dumping a foot of snow in the high country. They searched for days. All they ever found was his favorite wool cap, a faded red one I'd given him for Christmas 10 years prior, snagged on a branch by a rushing, ice-cold stream. A week later, my father, Charles, and my older brother, Garrett, held a press conference. I stood behind them, feeling like a prop in my own family's tragedy. Charles, oozing charisma from every pore of his $1,000 suit, spoke eloquently about Arthur's unforgettable legacy. Garrett, ever the golden child, stood beside him, his face a perfect mask of sorrowful duty. They looked the part, but I saw something else flicker in their eyes when they thought the cameras weren't on them. A glint of impatient opportunity. That night at the family estate, a place that now felt cold and alien, they weren't grieving. They were plotting. I walked into my grandfather's oak-paneled study to find them huddled over his desk, a bottle of his best single-malt scotch open between them. "To a new era," Charles declared, raising his glass. Garrett clinked his against it with a wide, wolfish grin. The air in my lungs turned to ice. A new era? Grandfather's body isn't even cold. They haven't even stopped searching. Charles turned to me, his smile evaporating. "He's gone, Eli. It's a tragedy, but the company needs leadership. The board is already nervous. We have to show strength." It was then that I saw it. A detail that would burn itself into my memory. A fresh, deep scratch across the crystal face of my father's expensive Swiss watch. He was a man who treated his possessions like extensions of himself, flawless and pristine. "What happened to your watch?" I asked, my voice low. Garrett stepped in front of my father, a defensive posture. "What's it to you? Dad's right. It's our time now. You've never understood business, Eli. You're too soft." "Soft?" I shot back, a tremor of rage starting in my chest. "This is his house, his company. His life's work you're carving up before he's even declared dead." My father's face hardened into a mask of cold dismissal. "You've always been a disappointment, Eli. Sentimental. Your grandfather coddled you, filled your head with nonsense about honor. This is the real world. And in the real world, you either lead or you get the hell out of the way." He gestured to the door with his glass. "You don't belong here anymore." I looked from my father's cruel eyes to my brother's smug face. My gaze fell on my mother, Clara, huddled in a large armchair in the corner. She was clutching a framed photo of her and Arthur, her face a landscape of grief so profound she seemed carved from stone. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She was a million miles away, a prisoner in her own home. In that chilling moment, I knew this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a crime. I didn't have proof. All I had was a gut-wrenching certainty, the image of a scratched watch, and the deafening silence of my mother. I turned and walked out, the rich aroma of my grandfather's scotch feeling like a sacrilege. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, I made a silent vow. I would find out what happened to Arthur Whitmore, no matter what it cost me. The 18 months that followed were a masterclass in loneliness. I found a small, 7th-floor apartment in a less fashionable part of Austin. It smelled perpetually of the coffee shop downstairs, a constant, bitter reminder of the countless sleepless nights I was enduring. It was my exile, a world away from the marble floors and hollowed-out family I had left behind. My work as an education consultant, helping anxious high school kids navigate their college applications, became my lifeline. It was honest, it paid the bills, just barely. And most importantly, it was mine. Meanwhile, my father and brother wasted no time. Whitmore Dynamics, a name built on half a century of trust, was unceremoniously buried. It was reborn as Marlowe Global, a name that sounded as sleek and soulless as the men who now ran it. They were a whirlwind of activity, gutting my grandfather's foundational principles with surgical precision. They chased high-risk, high-profit deals with shady international conglomerates, the very kind of deals I'd heard Arthur rail against for years. Couldn't let it go. The scratch on that watch was a splinter in my mind. My first move was to drain my meager savings account to hire a private investigator. His name was Frank, a former cop with cynical eyes and a crumpled suit, who operated out of a dusty office above a bail bondsman. He looked like a man who'd seen the worst of people and wasn't surprised by it anymore. "Let me get this straight," he said, leaning back in his squeaky chair after I'd laid out my story. "You think your dad and brother, two pillars of the community, bumped off your grandpa for the company? Kid, grief is a hell of a thing. It makes you see monsters in the shadows." "This isn't grief," I insisted, pushing the cashier's check for his retainer across the desk. "It's instinct. Just look into their travel records for that week. That's all I ask." Frank sighed, picked up the check, and shrugged. "Your money." For 2 weeks, a fragile hope bloomed in my chest. Frank was good. He called with updates. "Got something," he'd grunted over the phone one afternoon. "Your dad and brother weren't in Houston for that emergency meeting, like they told the press. They flew into Denver International the day before your grandpa went missing. Rented an SUV. The kind with 4-wheel drive." My heart hammered. It was a lie. Concrete, provable lie. "What else, Frank?" "Working on it. Trying to get GPS data from the rental company. It's tricky without a warrant. Let me call you back." That was the last I ever heard from him. A week of silence followed. I called his office. The line was disconnected. I called his cell. Straight to a dead voicemail. Finally, I drove to his office. The door was locked, and an eviction notice was taped to the glass. He was gone. Vanished. 2 days later, a plain white envelope arrived at my apartment. No return address. Inside was my original check, torn neatly in half, and a note scrawled on a greasy diner napkin. "Stop. You don't know who you're dealing with. Walk away before you can't." The message was clear. Charles had gotten to him. My own father had threatened, or paid off, a private investigator to shut down my search. The confirmation sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with my apartment's faulty air conditioning. It also left me completely powerless. My next stop had to be Victoria Reed. She had been my grandfather's COO, his most trusted confidant for over 20 years. She was brilliant, tough, and fiercely loyal. Of course, Charles had fired her within a month of the rebranding, citing a need for fresh perspectives. The reality was, she was an Arthur loyalist, and Charles couldn't risk having her around. I found her working for a small environmental nonprofit, her corner office replaced by a cramped cubicle. The fire I remembered in her eyes had dimmed to a wary ember. We sat on a park bench, the Texas sun making the air shimmer. "Eli, it's good to see you," she said, but her smile was brittle. I laid out the whole sordid story, the watch, the PI, the torn-up check. I begged for her help. Anything. An old file, a contact, an anomaly she might have noticed before she was forced out. She stared at her hands, twisting a simple silver ring around her finger. "I can't, Eli," she whispered, her voice strained. "When they forced me out, it wasn't just a severance check. The non-disclosure agreement they made me sign is a legal minefield. They can, and they will, sue me for everything I have and everything I ever will have. I have a daughter starting college next year. Her college fund. It's all I have. I can't risk it. But you know something is wrong." I pressed, my voice pleading. "I can see it in your eyes, Victoria." She finally looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "Your grandfather was worried weeks before his trip. He said Charles and Garrett were getting reckless. He was planning to make some changes to the company structure. Changes that would have limited their power. He never got the chance. She stood up abruptly. I'm sorry, Eli. I truly am. But be careful. They aren't just playing business anymore. She walked away, leaving me on that bench with a new piece of the puzzle that only made the picture darker. My grandfather was going to sideline them. And then he conveniently disappeared. The walls started closing in. My consulting business began to wither on the vine. I'd have a great meeting with the parents of a prospective student, feel that spark of connection, only to get an email a day later. We've decided to go in a different direction. It happened 4 times in a row. The last one, the father was a vice president at a bank that held a major loan for Marlowe Global. It was Charles's work, a subtle but devastating display of his power. He was strangling my livelihood, trying to starve me into submission. I even tried reaching out to my Aunt Susan, my mother's sister. I met her for coffee, hoping for an ally, a friendly ear. She seemed so sympathetic. "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed, patting my hand. "Charles can be such a bully. Your mother is so worried about you." A week later, my mother called me, her voice trembling. "Susan told me you're spreading terrible rumors, Eli, that you're not well. Charles is so disappointed. He just wants his family back together." My aunt had been a spy, twisting my words and reporting back, further cementing the narrative that I was the unstable one. The sense of betrayal was suffocating. My calls to my mother became exercises in futility. She was a ghost, echoing the script Charles had written for her. "Your father is just under a lot of stress, Eli. He's trying to protect your grandfather's company." "It's not grandfather's company anymore, Mom. Can't you see that?" I'd plead, my voice cracking with frustration. "Please don't," she'd whisper. "Please don't make this harder." One night, after my landlord had slipped a final warning notice under my door, I hit the wall. I sat in my dark apartment, staring at the city lights, a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey on the table. I was broke, discredited, and utterly alone. They had murdered the best man I'd ever known, hijacked his life's work, and had gotten away with it so completely that they'd even convinced my own mother I was the villain. I was beaten. The thought of giving up, of just disappearing and starting over somewhere no one knew my name, was a seductive whisper in the back of my mind. Maybe Frank and Victoria were right. Just walk away. I picked up the only framed photo in my apartment. It was of me and Arthur on a fishing trip when I was 16. I'd caught a tiny, pathetic-looking bass, but he was beaming at me with a look of such pure, unconditional pride. His handshake was firm, his word was solid. No, a cold, hard resolve solidified in my gut. I would not let them win. I would not let his legacy be a lie. It wasn't about the money or the company anymore. It was about honor. It was about that look in his eyes in the photograph. I poured the rest of the whiskey down the drain. The fight wasn't over. I had lost every single battle so far. But the war had just begun. I had no idea that my greatest weapon was about to walk out of a storm and knock on my door. The knock on my door came on a Tuesday night, a year and a half after I'd walked out of my family's home. A fierce Texas thunderstorm was rattling the windows of my apartment building, the kind of storm that makes you feel small and insignificant. I assumed it was the pizza delivery I'd ordered, my one small splurge for the week. I swung the door open, and the world tilted on its axis. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, soaked to the bone and leaning heavily on a crude, hand-carved cane, was a man who was both a stranger and the most familiar person in my life. He was terrifyingly thin, his face a roadmap of pain and exhaustion. His hair, once a distinguished salt and pepper, was now as white as snow. But the eyes, shadowed with fatigue as they were his. They were my grandfather's eyes. Grandfather! The name escaped my lips as a choked, disbelieving breath. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. It had to be a hallucination, a cruel trick played by my grief-addled brain. He offered a weak, crooked smile, a faint echo of the grin I knew so well. "Hello, Eli. Sorry to drop in unannounced." It's a bit wet out here. My paralysis broke. I grabbed his arm. It felt shockingly frail, and pulled him inside, slamming the door against the storm. He was real. He was solid. I could smell the rain and the damp wool of his old coat. He stumbled towards the only comfortable armchair I owned and collapsed into it, his breathing shallow and ragged. For a long moment, the only sound was his labored breathing and the drumming of the rain. My mind was a logjam of questions, a tidal wave of emotions so immense it felt like my chest would crack. How? I finally managed, my voice hoarse. They searched for weeks. We held a funeral. We buried an empty casket. He took a long, slow breath, his eyes hardening as a dark memory surfaced. The search party didn't find me because they were looking for a man who had an accident. They weren't looking for a man who had been pushed from a cliff. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and heavy. Pushed, I repeated, the word tasting like bile. They were with me, Eli, he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper that carried the weight of his betrayal. Your father and your brother. It wasn't a hunting trip for them. They flew in to confront me. I'd found out they'd been negotiating a merger behind my back, a deal with a soulless asset-stripping firm. It would have meant mass layoffs and the end of everything Whitmore Dynamics stood for. I told them I would block it. I was going to use my authority as majority shareholder to remove them from the board. Charles, he was livid. He closed his eyes, his knuckles white on the head of his cane. We were on a narrow trail, overlooking a ravine. The view was spectacular. I turned my back to look at the sunset. That's when I heard Charles, right behind me. His voice was cold, colder than I'd ever heard it. He said, "It's time for a change in leadership, Arthur." Then, I felt two sets of hands on my back. A powerful, coordinated shove. The sky and the earth switched places. I sank onto my worn-out sofa, the horrific scene playing out in my mind. The scratch on the watch, the celebratory scotch, their smug faces. It all snapped into place. "They tried to kill you," I said, the words a raw, ragged tear in the silence. "For money. For a promotion." He nodded, a single, tired motion. "They left me for dead. And by all rights I should have died. The fall was bad. I broke my leg in 2 places, shattered my collarbone, and 3 ribs. I think one of them punctured a lung. I lay there in the rocks, the creek water rising around me. I thought of you. I thought of your mother. And then, nothing. But how did you survive? Who found you?" "An angel," Arthur said, a flicker of warmth in his tired eyes. "An angel named Bobby Shepard. Turns out he's a former army medic, did a couple of tours in Afghanistan. Now he lives off the grid, prefers the company of trees to people. He was checking his traps after the storm passed and his dog found me. He said I was more dead than alive. He half-carried, half-dragged me back to his cabin, set my leg with splints made from branches, and fed me whiskey for the pain. He saved my life, Eli. He spent the better part of a year in that remote cabin, a ghost hidden in the vast wilderness of the Rockies. His recovery was brutal and slow. There was no phone, no internet, no way to contact the outside world without risking discovery. Bobby was his lifeline. "Why didn't you call me?" I asked, the old hurt of the last 18 months welling up. "I was looking for you. I knew something was wrong." "And what would we have done, son?" He countered gently. "If I had called, they would have traced it. If I had shown up at a police station, it would have been my word. The rambling story of an old man who just survived a traumatic fall. Against your father, a respected pillar of the community. They'd have hired the best lawyers, the best doctors. They'd have painted me as senile, brain-damaged from the fall. They would have had me committed, my assets frozen, my voting rights stripped. They would have finished the job just legally this time. No, I couldn't come back as a victim. I had to come back with a sword." While he was healing, Bobby had made cautious trips to the nearest town library, bringing back newspapers. That's how Arthur learned about the funeral, the rebranding to Marlowe Global, the gutting of his life's work. The grief and the rage, he said, were what fueled his recovery. He knew he had to fight back. He didn't have a perfect dossier of evidence. He had his story. He had his rescuer, Bobby. And he had the strategic mind that had built an empire. The rest, he told me, was up to us. The next day, I made the most terrifying and important drive of my life. I went to the estate. I used a lie about needing my mother to sign some old college fund documents for a tax audit. A fabrication bureaucratic enough that Charles wouldn't question it. I got her out of the house. She was quiet in the car, her fragility a tangible thing. When I pulled up in front of my rundown apartment building, she looked at me with confusion. "Eli, what is all this?" "Just trust me, Mom," I said, my voice softer than I intended. I led her up the rickety elevator and down the hall to my apartment. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Arthur was sitting in the armchair, the morning sun streaming in from the window, making his white hair look like a halo. Clara froze mid-step. Her expensive leather handbag slipped from her grasp. Its contents, lipstick, keys, a wallet, spilling across the cheap linoleum floor. A hand flew to her mouth, and a sound that was half sob, half gasp escaped her lips. "Arthur?" she whispered, the name a fragile prayer. He pushed himself up with his cane, his face breaking into a genuine, loving smile. "I'm here, Clara. I'm back." She rushed across the room and collapsed into his arms. And for the first time in a year and a half, I saw my mother truly cry. Not the silent, suppressed tears of a widow, but the great, shuddering, healing sobs of a daughter who had gotten her father back from the dead. Later, the three of us sat together, a broken family starting to piece itself back together. Clara, holding her father's hand as if she'd never let go, confessed her own private hell. She'd suspected. She'd seen the lack of grief in Charles, felt the coldness in the house. She tried to ask questions, but he dismissed her, treated her like a hysterical woman, and tightened his control over her finances and her life until she was too scared to speak. "He told me you were having a breakdown," she cried, looking at me. "He made me believe you were unstable." "Oh, Eli, can you ever forgive me?" "There's nothing to forgive, Mom," I said, my own eyes burning. In that small apartment, a war council was formed. Arthur was our strategist. Clara was our inside source, providing details about the house, the security, Charles's routines. And I was the soldier, the one who would lead the charge on the ground. The plan was no longer just about exposing them. It was about dismantling them, brick by brick, lie by lie. The days that followed were a blur of adrenaline and secrecy. My tiny apartment, once a symbol of my exile, transformed into the nerve center of our covert operation. Arthur, despite his physical frailty, possessed a mind as sharp and strategic as ever. He was our general, mapping out the campaign on a whiteboard I'd bought at a thrift store. I was his lieutenant, his hands and feet in a world he could no longer navigate openly. Our first order of business was to recruit the allies I had failed to win over on my own. My second call to Victoria Reed was different. I didn't plead this time. "Victoria, I need to see you," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "It's about Arthur." "Eli, I told you I can't." "He's alive, Victoria," I cut in. "He's sitting right across from me." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. "Where are you?" she finally whispered. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. When Victoria walked into my apartment and saw Arthur, her carefully constructed professional composure crumbled. She rushed to him, hugging him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I knew it," she sobbed. "I knew you wouldn't just disappear." Seeing him, hearing the story from his own lips, was the spark that reignited her fighting spirit. The non-disclosure agreement, the threats, her daughter's college fund. It all seemed secondary now to the monumental injustice that had been done. "They didn't just erase you, Arthur," she said, her voice trembling with a cold fury. "They desecrated your name. I'm in. Whatever it takes." Victoria became our weapon. She knew where Charles and Garrett had buried the bodies, financially speaking. She guided us to a slush fund disguised as a global consulting partnership, a black hole into which millions of dollars had vanished. It was the key to proving their financial crimes. Next, we needed an expert to prove their environmental crimes. I reached out to Dr. Emma Chin, the environmental scientist, again. This time, I had Arthur speak to her on the phone. His story, combined with the data I'd already shared, was all she needed. She agreed to conduct independent soil and water tests near the Oak Creek development, working pro bono. Our most crucial recruit was our lawyer. We needed a bulldog, someone unafraid of Marlowe Global's army of corporate attorneys. Victoria recommended David Chun, no relation to Dr. Chun, a semi-retired lawyer known for his scorched-earth litigation tactics against corporate giants. Our first meeting with David was an interrogation. He came to my apartment, a sharp, impeccably dressed man in his late 60s, and listened to our entire story without a single flicker of emotion. He cross-examined Arthur, then me, then Victoria, peppering us with questions, poking holes in our timeline, testing our resolve. "So, to be clear," he said after 2 hours, steepling his fingers, "your case currently rests on the testimony of a man who has been legally dead for 18 months. A former employee with an axe to grind, a son who stands to inherit, and some dirt in a jar. Marlowe's lawyers will eat you for lunch." My heart sank. But then David smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. "And I, for one, can't wait to watch them try. This isn't just a case. It's a legacy. I'm in." David's strategy was methodical. We wouldn't go to the press. We wouldn't go to a local police precinct. We would build an ironclad, multi-layered case and take it directly to the district attorney's office, giving them a high-profile conviction on a silver platter. The work was perilous. One evening, Victoria was remotely accessing the Marlowe Global servers from her home computer, digging for a specific wire transfer to the Shell Corporation. Suddenly, her screen froze. An administrator alert popped up. "Unusual login activity detected. System security audit in progress." She called me, her voice a panicked whisper. "He knows someone is in the system. Garrett is in the server room right now. I have to disconnect. If he traces the IP." Thinking fast, I had Clara make a call. She phoned the head of building security at the Marlowe Tower, a man who had worked for my grandfather for 30 years. In a frantic voice, she reported a fire alarm going off on the 25th floor, a floor that was empty for renovations. It was a lie, but it was a believable one. The building's emergency protocols kicked in. Alarms blared. Garrett was forced to evacuate the server room along with everyone else. In the chaos, Victoria's digital footprints were lost. The close call left us all shaken, a stark reminder of the stakes. The pressure began to wear on the team. We had a tense argument one night, Victoria worried that we were moving too slowly, me worried we were being too reckless. It was Arthur who calmed the waters. "Wars aren't won with one cavalry charge," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They're won by inches. By taking the ground you can, holding it, and then taking the next inch. We are taking ground." Our final target was Senator James Holloway. David's investigator found the senator's weak spot, a disgruntled former aide who had been fired for knowing too much about Holloway's gambling debts. I met the aide in a noisy bar. He was terrified. It took all my persuasive powers and a promise of legal protection from David to get him to talk. He gave us the name of the offshore casino where Holloway owed 6 figures, and the approximate date Charles Marlowe had made the debt disappear. We now had a case. We had motive, testimony, and corroborating evidence for fraud, environmental crimes, and political corruption. David Chin bundled it all into a thick binder. "We're ready," he announced one evening. "The annual shareholders meeting is in 2 weeks. That's our deadline. That's the day we present this to the DA. And that's the day you, Eli, will take back your family's company." The morning of the annual shareholders meeting was gray and oppressive, the Austin sky the color of concrete. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a coup. Following David Chen's meticulously crafted plan, I had used Arthur's still valid majority shareholding to force an emergency executive session immediately following the standard presentation. The single item on the agenda was a motion of no confidence in the CEO and his entire executive team. I walked into the gleaming, glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of the Marlowe Global Tower, the silence so profound I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The long mahogany table felt like a mile long. At its head sat my father, Charles, radiating an aura of untouchable power. Beside him, my brother, Garrett, smirked at me, the picture of smug confidence. The dozen or so board members, a gallery of corporate predators who had grown fat on my father's ruthless tactics, eyed me with open disdain. My mother, Clara, sat at the far end of the table, a small, still point of courage in the hostile room. Her presence was my anchor. "Well, Eli," Charles began, his voice a silken weapon of condescension. He gestured around the opulent room. "You've successfully called this extraordinary meeting. You have the floor. Let's hope you have something more compelling to say than you did the last time you were in this building." A few of the board members chuckled. My hands, hidden beneath the table, clenched so tightly my knuckles ached. I took a slow, deliberate breath and stood. The battle had begun. Round 1. "Thank you, Charles," I said, my voice colder and steadier than I felt. "You're right. The last time I was here, I had only suspicions. Today I have facts. I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here to talk about the ongoing criminal enterprise that is Marlowe Global." On cue, David, my lawyer, nodded to an associate, and the large presentation screen at the end of the room flickered to life. We didn't start with Arthur. We started with the money. Victoria had created a masterpiece of forensic accounting. Charts and diagrams filled the screen, detailing the slush fund disguised as a consulting partnership. We showed wire transfers to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. We showed falsified invoices. Then we moved to the environmental crimes. Dr. Chen's report was next, with color-coded maps showing the toxic runoff from the Oak Creek development and internal emails, provided by a brave mid-level manager Victoria had cultivated, showing that Garrett had explicitly ordered the use of cheaper, non-compliant materials. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. The smug amusement curdled into tense, watchful silence. Board members who had been slouched in their chairs were now sitting bolt upright, their eyes darting from the screen to Charles's impassive face. Charles let it all play out. When the presentation ended, he rose slowly, a predatory calm settling over him. It was time for his counterattack. Round 2. An impressive and theatrical performance. "Eli," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "A truly compelling work of fiction. Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the board, his tone shifting to one of paternalistic concern. "What you have just witnessed is a tragedy, a desperate, calculated attack by a bitter and failed son." His lawyer, a man with the face of a bulldog, began distributing thick, spiral-bound folders to each board member. My stomach turned. It was a meticulously crafted dossier on me. My business failures, my late rent payments, even a transcript of my conversation with Aunt Susan, twisted to make me sound unstable. "My son is in financial trouble," Charles continued, his voice dripping with faux pity. "He is attempting a hostile takeover to get his hands on an inheritance he believes he is owed. He has preyed upon his grieving mother's fragile emotional state and conspired with a disgruntled former employee to fabricate these fantasies. It is not an act of justice. It is an act of profound disrespect and greed. Frankly, it's pathetic." The narrative was powerful. The board members flipped through the dossier, their expressions hardening. I could see the tide turning against me. My evidence was a collection of documents. His story was a dagger aimed at my character. I had to act now. "You're right about one thing, Charles," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "This is about an inheritance, and it is about a crime. And for that crime, there is a witness." Charles actually laughed, a short, barking sound. "A witness? And who might that be? Are you going to hold a séance and call up the ghost of Arthur Whitmore?" "There's no need for a séance," I said, my eyes locked on his. "You can ask him yourself." The main doors to the boardroom swung open, and my grandfather walked in. The silence that fell was not just an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all thought, all breath. Arthur leaned on his cane with Bobby Shepherd at his side for support, but his back was straight, and his eyes were blazing. Charles's face went slack, the blood draining from it, leaving behind a waxy, pale mask. The heavy crystal tumbler of water in his hand slipped from his fingers and shattered on the polished floor, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness. Garrett froze, his jaw literally hanging open, his face a caricature of disbelief and terror. Every head in the room swiveled from the ghost at the door to the two men at the head of the table. Arthur walked slowly, each step a deliberate, resonant thud on the marble floor. He didn't look at Charles or Garrett. He walked to the empty chair beside me and slowly lowered himself into it, his eyes sweeping across the stunned faces of the board. "I am Arthur Whitmore," he said. His voice was not strong, but it carried the absolute, undeniable authority of a king returning to his throne. "And I am not dead. I was, however, left for dead at the bottom of a ravine in the Colorado Rockies by the two men you have entrusted with my company." The room erupted into chaos. "This is a trick," Garrett shrieked, finding his voice at last. "A sick joke. He's an imposter. Dad, tell them." Charles, recovering a sliver of his composure, lurched to his feet. "He's right. This is an absurd fabrication. This man is clearly unwell, delusional. Look at him. Security, get this man out of here." Two guards started forward, but they were stopped by another arrival. The doors at the back of the room opened, and Detective Michael Torres of the Austin PD walked in, flanked by two uniformed officers. He was calm, professional, and held a warrant in his hand. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Marlowe," Torres said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "That man is indeed Arthur Whitmore. My office has had him in protective witness custody for the last 48 hours. He turned his gaze to Charles and Garrett. "Charles Marlowe, Garrett Marlowe, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Arthur Whitmore, conspiracy, and multiple counts of financial and environmental fraud." Garrett completely fell apart. He wheeled on his father, his face a mess of tears and terror. "This was you. It was all your idea. You pushed him. I told you it was insane. I never wanted." Charles stared at his son, his golden child, the betrayal in his eyes replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated venom. He had been undone not just by his victim, but by his accomplice. As the officers moved in and snapped handcuffs onto their wrists, my father's eyes found mine across the table. There was no remorse, no regret, only a cold, bottomless promise of hatred. "You," he mouthed, a silent, chilling curse. The untouchable kings of Marlowe Global were being led away in handcuffs. In the ringing silence of the boardroom, my grandfather reached over and placed a frail, trembling, but impossibly strong hand on my shoulder. The war was over. We had won. The arrests detonated a bomb in the corporate and social landscape of Austin. The headlines were a surreal dream come true. Whitmore found alive. Son and grandson arrested in murder plot. The story was a feeding frenzy for the media. The pristine image of Marlowe Global, so carefully cultivated by Charles, was irrevocably shattered, revealing the cesspool of crime and greed that lay beneath. But while the world was glued to the unfolding criminal drama, a quieter, more brutal battle was being fought within the glass walls of the tower. The arrests didn't magically hand me the keys to the kingdom. The board was fractured. A few were genuinely appalled, but the majority were cold-blooded capitalists whose only allegiance was to the bottom line. Charles had made them rich, and they saw me and Arthur as a threat to that. They saw our principles as a liability. The emergency board meeting reconvened the following morning, the air thick with the stench of fear and opportunism. A slick, silver-haired board member named Henderson, a man who had been Charles's right hand in many a dirty deal, made his move. "The alleged actions of Charles and Garrett are, of course, shocking," he began, his voice a smooth bomb of corporate speak. "But we must not let this crisis jeopardize the stability of the company. We must protect our shareholders. What this company needs now is steady, experienced leadership, not a sentimental crusade led by a young man with no executive experience and an old man who has been, with all due respect, out of the game for nearly 2 years. He was making a play for control, trying to install himself as the interim CEO, to sweep the dirt under a new rug and continue business as usual. But David Chun was ready for him. Our lawyer stood, calm and collected. "Mr. Henderson, your concern for the shareholders is touching. However, you seem to be forgetting one critical detail. Mr. Arthur Whitmore is not just the founder. He is, and has always been, the majority shareholder. And his vote is not in question." David produced the legally unassailable documents proving Arthur's ownership. Then he produced a second document, freshly signed and notarized. Effective immediately, David announced, his voice ringing with finality, "Mr. Whitmore has transferred his full and irrevocable voting proxy to his chosen successor, his grandson, Mr. Eli Marlowe." A ripple of shock went through the room. I was no longer just the whistleblower. I was the power. Henderson's face turned a blotchy red. "This is an outrage. We will challenge this transfer in court. It's clear coercion." "You can certainly try," I said, my voice finding a new resonance of command. I looked directly at him. "But while your lawyers are busy with that, perhaps you can have them explain your signature on the payment authorization for the disposal of hazardous materials at the Oak Creek site. The one that used an unlicensed shell company you happen to be a silent partner in. Victoria had unearthed it the night before. The smoking gun." Henderson's face went pale. The fight drained out of him, replaced by the cold, hard terror of a man who knows he's been caught. He was trapped. One by one, we addressed the other hostile board members, using the evidence we'd compiled to expose their own complicity. By the end of the meeting, Henderson and two others had tendered their resignations. The rest fell in line. The war for the company was over. The criminal trial was a public spectacle. It was grueling. I testified. Victoria testified. Bobby Shepard testified, his simple, honest account of finding Arthur cutting through all the legal jargon. But the most powerful moment came when my mother, Clara, took the stand. The defense attorney, a shark in a tailored suit, was relentless. He tried to portray her as a weak, hysterical woman, easily manipulated by a vengeful son. "Mrs. Marlowe," he sneered, "isn't it true your son Eli was facing significant financial difficulties? That he stood to gain a vast inheritance if his father were to be removed?" Clara looked small and fragile on the witness stand, but when she spoke, her voice filled the courtroom. "My son stood to gain nothing but the truth. He lost his home, his business, and for a time he lost his family, all in the pursuit of that truth. The man I was married to," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "he didn't just try to kill my father, he tried to kill his soul. He built a kingdom of lies. The only inheritance I have ever cared about is the one of honor and integrity that my father taught me. An inheritance my husband and my oldest son threw away for greed." She looked directly at the jury, her gaze unwavering. It was devastating. The verdict was delivered a month later. Guilty. On all counts. Charles was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Garrett, who had turned state's evidence against his father in a desperate, failed attempt at leniency, received 15 years. Senator Holloway's career evaporated in disgrace as he faced his own federal corruption charges. A week after the sentencing, I went to the prison. I needed to see him one last time to close the door myself. He sat opposite me behind the thick, smudged glass, a ghost in a faded orange jumpsuit. He was smaller, diminished, but his eyes were still burning with a cold, hard rage. "Are you proud of yourself?" He spat into the intercom. "You've destroyed this family. You've destroyed everything I built." "You built nothing," I replied, my voice devoid of the emotion he wanted to see. "You only stole and corrupted what he built. You destroyed yourself, Charles." He laughed, a dry, bitter cackle. "You're still a naive little boy. You'll run that company into the ground in a year with your grandfather's soft-headed ideals. You'll see. You'll fail. There was no father there. There was no man. Only a black hole of narcissism and greed." I stood up. "Goodbye, Charles." I turned and walked away from the man who gave me life and then tried to ruin it. I didn't look back. That chapter was closed. The book of my own life was finally ready to be written. A single year can feel like a lifetime. The year that followed the trial was a relentless grind of 16-hour days, fueled by coffee and a desperate desire to prove my father wrong. Taking back the company was a victory, but rebuilding it was a war of attrition. The name Marlowe Global was radioactive. The first official act I took as CEO was to tear those letters off the top of the tower and restore the name that belonged there, Whitmore Dynamics. But a name on a building is just symbolism. The real work was in the guts of the company. With Victoria Reed, my newly appointed COO, we began the Herculean task of detoxifying the corporate culture and unwinding the web of corrupt deals Charles had spun. It was a financial and ethical minefield. We had to walk away from incredibly lucrative contracts with companies that didn't meet our new ethical standards. We had to fire executives who were brilliant but morally bankrupt. Our stock price plummeted. Wall Street analysts and financial news channels had a field day, gleefully predicting my failure. They called me the sentimental CEO, the naive son who would bankrupt his own inheritance out of misguided idealism. There were nights I'd sit alone in my grandfather's vast office, staring out at the city lights, and I'd wonder if they were right. The weight of his legacy felt less like an honor and more like an impossible burden. The pressure was suffocating. I wasn't just trying to save a business. I was trying to prove that capitalism and conscience could coexist. Our first great test came in the form of a difficult, painful decision. To stabilize the company, our accountants and lawyers strongly advised that we cut loose the divisions most deeply infected by Charles's corruption. This included laying off nearly 200 employees whose jobs were tied to those unethical projects. It was the smart, logical business school move. I couldn't do it. Instead, I called an all-hands meeting. I stood before the entire company. The anxious, uncertain employees who didn't know if they'd have a job tomorrow, and I laid out the truth. The previous leadership of this company betrayed your trust, I said, my voice echoing in the large auditorium. They pursued profits at the cost of our principles, and they put many of you in an impossible position. That era is over. But I will not fix their mistakes by creating 200 new victims. No one will be laid off. Instead, we are going to retrain and reinvest. We are launching a new division, the Whitmore Sustainable Futures Initiative. We are going to become a leader in green energy and ethical construction, and we need every single one of you to help us build it. It was a massive gamble, an expensive, risky, and perhaps foolish bet on people over profit. But it was a bet my grandfather would have made. Our next major trial was the Oak Creek Housing Project, the development built on toxic land. The legal advice was unanimous. Declare bankruptcy on that specific subsidiary, wall off the liability, and move on. It would save the parent company hundreds of millions in potential lawsuits and cleanup costs. Instead, I flew to Oak Creek. I walked through the neighborhood, a place of neat little houses and worried families. I met a young couple, the Garcias, in their living room. Their 5-year-old daughter had been suffering from respiratory problems since they'd moved in. They showed me her drawings, taped to the refrigerator. They had sunk their life savings into this home, this dream, and it had become a nightmare. That afternoon, I held a press conference in the Oak Creek Community Center. I didn't bring a lawyer. I just brought the truth. We failed you, I said, looking into the faces of the families gathered there. Under its previous leadership, Whitmore Dynamics, then Marlowe Global, put profit before your health and safety. There is no excuse for that, and we are here to make it right. I announced that Whitmore Dynamics would fund the complete, no-cost relocation of every single family in the development to a new, safe home. Furthermore, we would bear the full, uncapped cost of the environmental cleanup and restoration of the Oak Creek site, overseen by Dr. Emma Chin and her independent team. The financial world called it corporate suicide, but the Garcias and the dozens of other families like them called it a miracle. The story went national. For the first time, the headlines associated with our company weren't about crime, but about accountability. Slowly, painfully, we began to earn back a currency more valuable than money: trust. We poured our remaining capital into the sustainable energy projects Arthur had always dreamed of. It was a long shot, But new investors began to appear, pension funds, ethical investment groups, people who wanted to build something for the long term. Our stock began to climb, slowly at first, then with real momentum. We were proving that you could do good and do well. My personal life settled. I sold the cold, cavernous family estate and used the proceeds to establish the Arthur Whitmore Foundation for Business Ethics. Its mission: to provide seed money and mentorship for young entrepreneurs who wanted to build companies with a conscience. My mother, Clara, found a new life. She moved to a small cottage on the coast and became a fierce advocate and volunteer at a local women's shelter. She was no longer a victim, but a warrior, using her experience to empower others. My grandfather never got to see the company's full resurrection. He passed away peacefully in his sleep about 6 months after the trial ended. I was with him. He had spent his last months in Colorado, surrounded by the mountains he loved, with Clara and me by his side. His last words to me were, "You did it, Eli. You kept your word." He died at peace, knowing justice had been done and his legacy was safe. I miss him every day. Last week, on the anniversary of his passing, I stood on that quiet hill where he's buried. I told him about the Garcia family and how their daughter was breathing easy in their new home. I told him Victoria was running the company like a seasoned general. I told him we were going to make it. As the wind rustled the pines, I realized that Charles had been wrong about the inheritance. I had never wanted to inherit his money or his power. I had been forced to inherit his fight, and in winning it, I had finally forged my own identity. It's strange how a life can be completely demolished and then rebuilt into something stronger. 5 years ago, I was an outcast, a pariah to my own family, a broke consultant in a cramped apartment, shouting a truth that nobody wanted to hear. Today, I'm the CEO of a company that is slowly but surely becoming a benchmark for ethical business. A company that proudly bears my grandfather's honorable name. But the real transformation isn't measured by a title on a business card or the view from a corner office. In fact, I spend as little time in that office as possible. Right now, I'm standing on a dusty construction site 40 miles east of Austin. The Texas sun is beating down, and the air is alive with the whine of saws and the rhythmic thud of hammers. This is the site of our first community of affordable, net-zero energy homes. Built with sustainable materials, powered by the sun, designed for families, not for profit margins. My sleeves are rolled up, my boots are caked in mud, and I'm hashing out a supply chain issue with Maria, the site foreman. This is where I feel most like myself. Not in a boardroom debating stock options, but here on the ground, a part of building something real. Something that will last. A few minutes ago, a young couple, the Jacksons, who are on the list to move into one of these homes next month, stopped by with their 2 kids. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 6, ran up to me and handed me a crayon drawing of a lopsided, smiling sun shining down on a square house with a triangle roof. "This is for you," she said shyly, "for building our house." I knelt down and looked her in the eyes. "Thank you. It's the best payment I've ever received." Her parents beamed. That look on their faces, one of hope, security, and gratitude. That's the real profit margin. That's the quarterly report I care about. My father believed legacy was an empire of power and money, a fortress built to keep the world out. My grandfather taught me that legacy is a garden. It's something you cultivate with care, day by day, choice by choice. It's in the foundation of the homes you build, in the strength of the promises you keep, and in the lives you help to grow. He taught me that real leadership isn't about standing on top of everyone else. It's about kneeling down to help someone up. The deep, burning anger I carried for so long has cooled into a quiet, steady resolve. I didn't just win back a company. I won back my life from the brink. I fought for my grandfather's honor, and in the crucible of that fight, I finally discovered my own. His legacy is safe, and now my own is just beginning. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with you in some way. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight for what you believed in, even against the people closest to you? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next.